Hello there, and welcome to the very first episode of Coming to Our Senses. My name is Nick, and I'm your host for this podcast. I'm very excited to be getting this project off the ground. This is a topic that's near and dear to my professional and personal life, and one that I'm excited to share with you all. So the plan for today is short and sweet. I want to tell you a little bit about myself and my interest in this topic, and then talk about the podcast, my goals for the coming episodes, the format, the structure of how each episode will go, and then the context for the topic, for why we are talking about sensation and what it means to come to our senses. So a little bit about me. I'm 26. I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina. I moved to Minnesota for undergrad and then to Illinois for graduate school. I'm currently in the 5th year of a PhD program at Northwestern University, and I study sociology, so I look at the social. But in particular, my academic interests and my personal interests align along the lines of food. I've been interested in cooking and eating ever since I can remember, as a lot of us are, and have a lot of influences from family members growing up that taught me to cook and who I could bond with over the language of food, right? In fact, my grandmother in Chile didn't speak any English, and I didn't speak any Spanish growing up, and so we only had food as a language, and so food is very near and dear to my heart, and as you can imagine, a very sensory form of communication. So eating, tasting, smelling, feeling food, it's all part of it. So my dissertation at the moment looks at how migrant communities use food culture and particularly the sensory components of food to make connections in their local communities and with communities around the world. I find that studying through food, studying while people are cooking or eating, is a really simple yet effective way to make a bond with someone, to create and establish a sense of trust, which is super important to forming a relationship with between a researcher and a participant. So that has been kind of my foray into the literature on food and the literature on sensation. My interest in the topic comes from this kind of deep-rooted interest in the everyday. I think a lot of times we focus on big, large macro scale politics, economics, even culture too. And that's important. It's really important to know those patterns, but at the more quotidian or everyday level, what we do in our mundane day-to-day lives, such as cooking and cleaning and going to and from an occupation, are oftentimes really sensorial experiences, right? Taking a bite of food can elicit, memory. It can make you feel a certain way. It can be emotional, just as the way, a political election or, these mass events that we focus on in the news often can be sensationalized. So my interest in sensation is grounded in those kind of personal and academic trajectories. I'm now in this period where I'm trying to contribute to a literature based on dissertation research that I'm conducting, and have been really investigating sensation for the last year and a half in particular, and then more generally for the last 5 or 6 years. So I want to share some of that with you and have you guys learn with me some of the most important and essential physiological and social aspects of sensation. So for today, as I mentioned, I wanted to tell you a little bit about what the podcast will look like. I'm believe that the goal is going to have each episode run between 20 and 30 minutes, but I know as a teacher that I can run long with my monologues. And then those will be weekly, put out, I believe, on Tuesdays. And then every once in a while, I'm going to invite a guest, often a friend or a fellow academic, to join me and talk about their topic of interest or expertise, and some of the things that we're going to be looking at in the coming weeks will get really into the nitty-gritty of some of our sensations. So just to give you kind of a rundown of what some of those sensory topics will be, I'm thinking next week of talking a little bit about sensory deprivation in film. So I want to focus on some of the movies that I'm sure you may have seen if you're into horror, but Bird Box and A Quiet Place have both come out in the last few years, so I want to dive into how they talk about sensory deprivation. I think it would be neat to do a deep dive into how COVID has shifted our sensory perceptions, not just the anosmia that comes with losing your sense of smell, but also the inability to touch, through quarantines and social distancing. And then I'd be interested in talking a little bit about my own research on, again, that intersection between migration and the senses, or diving into the kind of beautiful connection between sensation and memory, or sensation and emotion, really talking about that intersection between how what we feel makes us who we are. So that's the kind of, next couple of weeks. I'm thinking, things can change as well. This is mostly for me to kind of take a deep dive in my own direction. But I'd love to hear from anyone who has thoughts on what is important sensorially to get into. So that's the logistics. I think one of the things that is most important to discuss today as well is what is sensation and why does it matter to you? So let's do that. I think one of the main kind of beautiful aspects of sensation is that it's not purely and perfectly defined yet. You can ask, 10 different people who've studied sensation what sensation is, and you'll probably get a number of different answers depending on their background and how they view sensation. Personally, I'm going to have a sociological bent to all this, and what that means is basically thinking, okay, it's not just what our body does physiologically, but how those physical, biological practices influence our interactions, how we become social. I promise to do as much justice as I can to the psychological, but we'll be doing up a lot of reading alongside the podcast to have that background. And so with that, I think, it's good to hop into a biological, psychological definition of the senses. And a sense for psychologists or for biologists is a physiological function. It's at the cellular level, it's this response. It's a response to some form of physical stimulation. And that stimulation sends signals to our brain for processing. So, this is normally broken down into 5 senses. We can, go through them as you can imagine. The main 5 are sight. Sight is technically oriented around the perception of color. So our rods and cones. Cones being used for color, and then rods being used for brightness, so color and brightness. Taste, which is kind of my sense of my favorite sensation, is typically oriented around taste receptors or taste buds, and we think of that as being located in the mouth, on the tongue. And we have receptors for 5 different tastes, and those are sweet, salty, bitter, sour, and umami. Now, one of the kind of interesting anecdotes about taste is that oftentimes people try to rope spiciness into taste, and I think all sensation is socially constructed, and we'll get into that, but spiciness is not a biological receptor for sweet, salty, sour, bitter, umami. It's not a taste bud that you have on your tongue. It's actually a chemical burning. It's a particular chemical that it's called capsaicin, which burns your tongue or your mouth upon its consumption, and leaves you with that spicy feeling, that spicy chemical feeling. So it's not technically we don't have receptors for taste. We have receptors for pain, and that's what spiciness is. So that's taste. We have sight, taste. We have touch, and touch is kind of an elusive sense in that we have different forms of touch, from temperature and pain to itchiness, pressure, and then pleasure can even be considered a tactile sense. And so, we'll get into the kind of nuances, but that's the third of the five. Smell is another one, and smell is very heavily linked to taste in that it's also chemical, and it's located, in the nose, the olfactory receptors, which are right next to your mouth as well. And so, flavors and aromas are intimately linked. We'll talk about that. But smell is a chemical reaction as well, and you can test the relationship between smell and taste, obviously, by closing your nose when you're trying to eat and taste, and you can see that is, of course, much more subdued, if not non-existent, without smell. And then finally there's sound, and sound is a form of vibration. It's the receptors that are typically within your eardrums that are vibrating alongside some, aural stimulation. So music, voice, it's all vibrations. And so those are the kind of classic five, as you are probably well aware. But one of the kind of interesting things about sensation, and particularly from a sociological point of view, is that the senses are socially constructed, meaning we have made these divisions between what is sound, what is smell, what is taste. And in reality, they're kind of blurred. And you can imagine as you live your life, never experience just one. Even if you have a deprivation of sorts, if you can't, physiologically see or smell or taste, there's no way that you're operating under, one sense or at a time, one sense at a time. And so, the social construction of the senses just means that those divisions are kind of our own choices. We give them biological bases, but even biologically or physiologically, we don't have perfect distinctions between what is smell and taste, what is sound and sight, for instance. And the other interesting thing is that every sensation is actually a form of touch, if you think about it, because to taste, you have to put some form of flavor on your tongue. To hear, you have to put some form of vibration in your ears. To see, it's some form of light ray on your eyes, and et cetera, et cetera. So, it's important to think about when we want to dive into sensation, the beauty of how unspecified it is and how we are making these distinctions and how we can think beyond those distinctions into the possibilities of sensation. So the divisions between the five classic senses are socially constructed. And then there are also other sensations that we have that are either physiologically based or ideologically based, and there's merit to both. To give you kind of a couple of examples of that, you've probably heard of the idea of a sixth sense, right? This ability for kind of preconception or pre-perception, excuse me. You've probably heard of something called proprioception or interoception, which is how we perceive our body in space and how we perceive the inside of our body. You might have heard of the idea of thirst and hunger being separate forms of touch or of pain or pleasure. And then there's more. I mean, the perception of time, how we understand ourselves vis-a-vis the movement of time, the ourselves yesterday versus tomorrow versus today. And then there's things like kinesthesia, how we move, how we sense how we move, how we understand thermoception, which is, heat and cold. And so you can imagine, the beauty of this is that there are many sensations that, we are kind of identifying how they work and how we perceive them, right? How we interpret them. So that's a sense. We're going to go into kind of the nuances of sensation, the nuances of each sense as we've canonically defined them, and also the blurred lines, right? When we talk to guests, some of their professions will use very specific sensory perception, very specific sensory backdrops or backgrounds. For instance, we may talk to someone who works with wine, a connoisseur of wine, or someone who is aware of the importance of taste and smell to the flavor of wine, to tasting wine, and being able to talk about it. And so that's, our goal is to basically interpret how the biological meets the social, and how we interpret or make sense of, make meaning of sensation. And so, to break down, a sense might be the biological, and a sensation might be our interpretation of the meanings, the emotions, the memories associated with that. And for me, what's super interesting is how those biological capabilities become social. So for instance, if you walk by a bakery and you smell the bread coming out of it, you obviously might have a biological response to be hungry. You might your mouth might start watering. You might decide to step in and get a piece of bread. But you might also associate it with a pastry that a family member made as a kid, or you might smell that and feel like, oh, I didn't know that we had a bakery in this neighborhood. I wonder who is owning or running that bakery. And that's just an example. I mean, there's tons with perfume or food in general, where the smells, the tastes, the feelings of different items can elicit different emotional responses. And that's what's interesting, is how we interpret and make meaning and come to understand how we are both sensorially oriented and socially oriented. So that's a long way of saying that we should come to our senses. This podcast is going to dive into different topics, as you can imagine. And I thought we could end today talking about flavor. This episode is called The Spice of Life, and it's perhaps important to think about the different ways that flavors orient how we perceive the world, beyond just I need food because I need to sustain my body. I need to be a functioning human. So a couple interesting facts about flavor. One, biologically and evolutionarily, we have evolved to have a varied diet, and because of that, we have different sensory receptors for taste. And so if we could only taste sugar, if we could only taste sweetness, we would probably only eat sweet things, and we would then probably have way more health issues than we do. And so the capability to taste different forms of flavor, to have an interest or a palate for saltiness or bitterness, is to allow our bodies to crave different nutrients, different vitamins associated with different flavors. Flavor is affected by other sensations, as you can imagine, like we talked about plugging your nose, but also the look of something, the color can definitely affect the way we perceive what a food tastes like. A classic example is children, obviously having a distaste for vegetables, and vegetables being green, and so green things being associated with bad taste is definitely one of those multisensory or transsensory experiences. We talked about spiciness not being a flavor, but other communities, other cultures that don't recognize just 5 flavors talk about other flavors, such as fattiness, or a lot of communities that don't don't have as many perceptions of saltiness as we might have distinctions in American or Western cultures. And finally, we have a number of flavorful reactions in language, or flavorful metaphors, excuse me. So the this episode is obviously called The Spice of Life. That's probably a saying you've heard before. But we also have other important meanings behind flavors. So if you call somebody sweet, it means that they're kind, right? If you call somebody salty, they're angry. If you call them bitter, they're resentful. If you call them sour, they're spiteful. And so language is very much influenced by our day-to-day perceptions, and flavor, taste being one of them. So that's a kind of interesting fun facts about taste. I think the more sociological take that I can offer you today is that flavor also influences our drive to do pretty much anything. And that can be small scale, from getting out of bed, to large scale, moving across the world. Two classic examples are the spice trade, the spice route, which ran from Europe to East Asia for a long, long time in the early 800s, 900s, on through up until today, really, but through the mid into the 1500s, 1600s. And the second example is the pursuit of spices and colonization of the Americas. And the kind of most beautiful history that's been written about this is probably Sidney Mintz's book, Sweetness and Power, which looks at the really brutal and kind of history shifting trade of sugar between the colonies in the Americas and Europe. And so Sidney Mintz writes about the kind of triangle of trade, obviously being between Europe and the U.S., but then also between slave traders in the Americas and Africa. And in his book, he looks at how taste for sweetness, or the craving of sweetness, shifted in a period of about 150 years in England, which drove one of the biggest industrialization projects in the world to come to fruition. So basically, he shows that in Europe, only the elite could have sugar for a very long time. And this was due in part because sugar was incredibly rare. You could only get it through certain fruits, honey, and sugar cane itself was not produced in mass. And so in Europe, the elites would have, fancy meals, fancy cakes, fancy forms of sugar art that were made for big parties. They used sugar for medicinal recipes. It was considered a spice like other spices, and mixed in small increments into dishes, and even used as a form of toothpaste at one point. And so communities around England at the time that were lower or middle class had no real relationship with sugar, other than perhaps to know it was a form of royalty, a form of class status. But that started to change when, in the kind of pursuit of having better access to spices, including sugar and including the cravings of sweetness, ventures started heading westward towards the Americas, obviously in pursuit of what was then thought to be India, but arriving into Central America, into the islands of modern-day Haiti, the Dominican Republic, northern Latin America, or northern South America, so Brazil, throughout Mexico, into North America. And so the arrival of colonialists and their parties led to the trade and exchange of numerous goods, and the Columbian exchange, as it's known, or the Columbian extraction, perhaps better said, is one of the most important flavor moments of human history, of this exchange of different products and palettes from the Americas to Europe. And one of the things that came from Central Asia to Europe and then eventually into the colonies of the Americas was sugarcane. And sugarcane had this incredible capacity for growing in the Caribbean, in that climate which was warm year-round and which had incredible soil and was incredibly fertile. And as soon as merchants realized that the sugarcane was growing incredibly productively, the projects became larger scale, almost exponentially overnight. To make that happen, a couple of things had to go right for European settlers. The first was that they had to colonize and conquest the lands on which to grow the sugarcane. As we know, there are very brutal histories of genocide of Native Americans from issues of health, smallpox, disease, and obviously war and incredible violence and torture. That was the first thing that had to happen, was the conquest of the Caribbean, of northern, what is modern day northern Brazil, for these sugar plantations. And the second was the export of the capable infrastructure, the technology, the rooms, the processing plants for sugarcane to the colonies. And this setup, was very rapid. As soon as there was a monetary incentive, a lot of rulers sent their backing, their financial backing. And so the third thing that had to happen was to find a form of labor, of cheap labor for these plantations. And as we know, that came in the form of slavery, and in the form of shipping massive quantities of enslaved African people from typically West Africa into the colonies. And estimates of the numbers are in the dozens and dozens of millions. Pretty atrocious history, and one that has incredible repercussions for the modern day existence of Haiti and the Dominican Republic and Brazil and other post-slave trade countries. And so how does this relate to sensation, and how does this relate to our conversation about flavor? Well, the onus for this massive project, which paralleled a lot of the Industrial Revolution, was sweetness, was our craving for sweetness. And one of the kind of biological theories about why we crave sweetness is that in nature, sweetness is actually pretty rare. It's hard to find. It's in fruit, in honey, in in sugarcane, which wasn't really cultivated in mass until this moment that we're talking about. And so sweetness was this motivation for thousands and thousands of settlers to move into the Americas, to set up their plantations, to destroy local ecosystems and kill native communities, and to import the infrastructure and the labor needed to run these mills, and to create this multi-billion-dollar infrastructure for selling sugar. And going all the way back to our conversation about how only the elite could afford sugar in Europe. Well, after decades of this colonization and creation of these sugar plantations, sugar became incredibly cheap to buy in Europe because of these plantations. And so now not only the elite had access to sugar, to the very flavor of sweetness, but so did the middle and lower class British communities or your English communities. And so these new consumers of sugar found ways to introduce it into their diet in the form of sweetened products, right? In the form of tea with sugar, cakes, everyday products, and especially because sugar became one of the ways of preserving certain meals, it became part of pretty much everyday culinary consumption or gastronomic consumption. And so these practices around eating and pursuing and craving sweetness really can be traced back to the social processes of colonizing and building this infrastructure in the Americas. And this is really on the kind of motivation of finding an access to sweetness and other spices in ways that we didn't have them before. And so, sweetness can be a form of communication today where you give somebody a cake and it's obviously a celebratory gift. Sweetness can be associated with dessert, with celebration, with indulging in different pleasures. But it can also have this incredibly large-scale global history that influences the, economic situations in Central America up until this day. So this is, a deep dive into something that we might not think about every day in forms of, quotidian sensorial ways that we have become social beings. And I'm hoping to do some more exploration of the senses and their social meanings with you all, if you choose to tune in the coming weeks. But this is just a start, a flavor, if you will, of what this podcast has to offer and what my goal is going forward. So as I mentioned, I'm going to hopefully be uploading these weekly. I think today I'm going to be running a little bit long just because it's the first one and because I had a lot to explain and convince, hopefully, you all to stick around. And next week, like I said, we'll be hopping into a new topic, probably the idea of sensory deprivation in horror film. And so I hope you'll tune into that. You can check us out on Twitter. The handle is senses_podcast, and you can find us on Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcast. So thank you for tuning in to this very first episode of Coming to Our Senses. I hope you feel inclined to tune back in next week, and I look forward to hearing any ideas you have for how to make the podcast run smooth into the future. So with that, I'll leave you, and thanks again for tuning in. This has been Coming to Our Senses.